basically, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. John was giving examples of developments that do actually work and the problems we have with planning schemes that get in the way of that. And Jason was taking a very scientific approach to understanding, with his example of trees and the rest of it. When Jason was talking of, I can remember we were landscaping a park and we looked at the people sitting in the park, and there was a big paved area that they'd sort of spent a lot of money sort of painting lines on for basketballs and stuff. No one used it, and everyone was sitting underneath the trees. Quite stunning. With everything that we've discussed today, what's the first thing you would expect Liam to start looking at? How do we fix this?
Can I go first?
Go for your life. And then after that, you can just keep going around and round.
So I would really love to see Liam kick the crap out of the Tasmanian planning system.
Yeah,
so
Yeah.
we had what arguably, as several speakers have said today, was world's best practice in the 1990s. When LUPA was created, and the RMPS, a fantastic planning system, resource management system that puts sustainability right at the front. Since then, it's been eroded to the point where you have the inglorious accolade of having the fastest development approval system in the country in Tasmania. Despite what developers will tell you, it is the fastest in the country by a long shot. And you have a statewide single town planning scheme with not a single provision in it, as John has said, that relates to core environmental requirements that you'll find in other states, such as vegetation protection. So if a council wants a developer to plant trees, for example, if they clear a site and then they put in new housing, they can't request that. One last one I want to touch on is, you mentioned parks. In other states in Australia, we have a minimum of 10% of the subdividable area being required for parks and open space. In Tasmania, it's 5%, and oftentimes councils waive that because developers complain. So if you wonder why you've got no parks in your neighbourhood, that's one of the key reasons. So really, if you want a place to go after and go hard, one of the key areas I would tackle would be the statewide planning scheme, which I think is just rubbish.
And another example I'd cite is the parking requirement. One car for every 50 square metres of commercial space in Hobart. In Sydney, it's one for every 100 square metres. I don't think there are fewer cars in Sydney. I don't know why we have to be so accommodating here.
I'll just add one comment an observation rather than the comment. Susan Ley, when she was Federal Minister for the Environment, started talking about project approvals rather than a project assessment process. And just a simple change of one word has massive implications when it comes to development of any sort, because if it's an approvals process, well, then the developer knows when they submit their paperwork, it's an approvals process. They're going to get the tick at the end of the exercise. It should be an assessment process, and a couple of times I've heard state ministers here in Tasmania, Freudian slip, I give them the benefit of the doubt that it's an approvals process rather than an assessment process. And just by changing that one word, it undermines the confidence in the community as to whether or not there's going to be a legitimate process of assessing any development.
Yeah, I think the Hobart City Council's on record for saying that about 98% of the developments it looks at are approved.
Approved, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's fine. If they're consistent with the planning scheme and they tick all the boxes, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But don't call it an approvals process. Call it an assessment process, because that's what it should be.
Yeah. So a second point I'd love to just touch on really quickly, which all the speakers addressed today, and it's part of my backstory, first of being a planner and an environmental officer in Western Australia, and then going to the US to do my PhD, was I left to the US as an avowed deep ecologist. So my ideal world that I saw was putting on a caftan and walking up and down in a narrow trench to minimise my environmental impact. When I got to the US, I met a Marxist geographer, David Harvey, who I was very fortunate to spend a year auditing his classes and talking with. So this is a Marxist geographer. And he challenged me and said, well, that's a really elitist viewpoint. I want you to think about this idea of environmental justice. And I want you to think about who wins environmental benefits and who loses, who gets left behind. And I especially want you to think about something called environmental blackmail, the jobs versus environment blackmail. And oftentimes we reduce our conversations around things like the State of Environment report. As part of convincing communities, we tell them, well, you can't have both. You can't have jobs and the environment, choose. And that's outrageous and it's wrong. And I think that any response that we do collectively needs to tackle that full on and say, no, you can have both. It is feasible to have both.
There was a very good article by Professor Ewan Ritchie that was published in the Victorian, I want to say like Victorian Naturalist or Victorian Museum, whatever. It was just 3 pages, but completely debunks those myths around the polarization of jobs or environment.
Yeah.
And I can flick that through and get it. Because it's written for the lay person, and it completely debunks in very simple language why that dichotomy is just patently wrong. So no, that's a very productive way to spend 5 minutes reading. Have you seen it?
I'm a big fan of Ewan's
Yeah.
work.
Okay. So
Who was that author?
Ewan Ritchie, EUANRITCHIE. Is he a deacon? No.
Yeah, I'm not
Yes,
sure
I think he's a deacon. But anyway, if you just do a Google search for Ewan Ritchie, debunking, that's probably enough to get the article.
Yeah, look, we'll...
I'll flick it through, and then it can be easily. It's in the public domain. It's an open access article, so it's not a problem.
What was the name?
The name Ewan Ritchie.
Ewan.
Ewan, EUAN.
Okay, so the next big developments in Tasmania are going to be renewable energy. We have a number of renewable energy zones. We've got very big blue ones on a map, and I'm wondering if they're in the right place. Vanessa's gone, Jason, but I'm guessing you would have some insights into what she's thinking, and you may also have some insights.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's not my key area of specialisation. Vanessa's in the office right next door to me. We were both lucky to land future fellowships at the same time. So
You got one too?
Yeah, so we
Bloody hell.
we talk regularly about these kinds of issues.
All right.
It's a challenge, right? We want to make sure that we are not wiping out any more species than what we're losing already. Surely that has to be our north arrow when it comes to our actions. At the same time, we want to rapidly decarbonise. I don't think that it's an either-or argument here as well. I think oftentimes it's painted that way, as either you allow us to put in the wind turbines or you're doomed. I think what we need are better ways, like John has pointed to in the way that he develops, better ways of thinking about our impacts, thinking about the technologies we use, evaluating the potential harm that will come from our actions, and then finding the alternative combination of technologies and public support and strategies to minimise that impact. That's where I think we'll find the best uptake, but I'm keen to hear from others on the panel as well.
Those renewable energy zones that were released were done so with minimal, if any, public consultation. And so people literally woke up one day and looked at the newspaper and discovered that they were living in a renewable energy zone. So surprise, surprise, there's pushback, for anything going forward on that. I made the point when Vanessa was talking, there is no strategic planning or zoning for renewable energy in Australia, onshore or offshore. AEMO has, the Australian Energy Market Operator, has drawn these big blobs on the Australian landscape as well. they're simply derived from a global wind energy map. It's wind, maybe just wind.com, but it's really that level of a resource. And pretty much, certainly in Tasmania, anyone who's got a windy block of land can put up their hand and say, I want to build a wind farm. I think I've got the resource here. It's very much a shotgun approach to renewable energy, and that's for both solar as well as wind. And it's equally true in the offshore arena, because I'm working with the feds, trying to come up with ways that. There was an article, an editorial in the Mercury a couple of years ago that said, we really should be putting all these wind farms offshore. There's no birds in the ocean. It's like albatrosses. That just comes to mind straight away. There's this remarkable degree of ignorance when it comes to what we're dealing with and the spectrum of values and the complexity of the issues and interactions that we need to deal with. And in many ways, offshore wind farms present a greater range of issues to deal with because you've got migratory corridors. So if all the wind farms that are proposed for Bass Strait come true, we're talking about, certainly well over 1,000 turbines in Bass Strait. And yet we have this migration corridor of all the woodland birds, all our little wood garden birds that disappear to the mainland. We've got migratory shorebirds that come from Siberia. You've got orange-bellied parrots, from the southwest. Everything, Bass Strait is this migration corridor that's used by millions of birds, and the perception is there's no birds in the water. It's just, there's a disconnect, and I just don't know how we can really deal with that. I mean, I made the comment to one of the questions, the messaging has to be consistent, but it's just getting the basic, sometimes just what appears to be basic scientific knowledge. It reinforces to me how scientifically illiterate much of Australia's community is in many things.
You go, John.
Further to the point we were talking about Greens policy before,
Yep.
My first job was actually the university architect at UTAS, and I built the Centre for Environmental Studies for Dick Jones, where your colleague went. Unfortunately, he died in the middle of that, falling off his roof at home.
Yep.
But I was party to, because of that consultation, to various arguments between Bob Brown and he. And Dick's basic point was always, don't hit me with that populist shit. He said, it's got to be based on rigorous science or you're never going to get near it. It's absolutely got to be watertight. And he critiqued his students and insisted that they had to have solid scientific basis to everything they did. And the minute that he died, Bob took it off in the direction of what do people want to hear, and we'll tell them what they want to hear. If Dick was still running the Greens, I'd probably be a Green now, I think.
I mean, one of the I suppose, threads to my presentation this morning, and it was partly at the request of Martin and Lean, where the coast and marine indicators you saw have a high degree of reliability or a high degree of confidence because we used longer term data sets. We had some really nice 40, 50, 60-year data sets. It means that you may not like the story that the data tells you, but you can't argue with that story. You can't deny an 80, well, some people can, some presidents-elect denying, but the reality is if you've got an 80-year data set that shows that the sea surface temperature off Maria Island has gone up 3.5 degrees in May, you can't really argue with that. And that's true across the spectrum, not just in the marine, but terrestrial as well.
Yeah. So just picking up on a couple of those points, I think framing really matters. And when we look at the State of Environment report, what we should be looking at is not just what's present, but also what's absent. What's not in this report that was there in earlier reports. There's a little hint in the current State of Environment report, the 2024 one, about reducing our consumption. Just a very, very small hint. That's often not talked about, right? We assume that we need more energy, more wind turbines. One of the biggest success stories in Australia, environmental success stories, which is such a paradox, is rooftop solar. So it's resulted in the closing down of coal-fired power stations that we couldn't close down in any other way, right? But people want rooftop solar. They see it as being meaningful, whether it's reducing their power consumption, whether it's making a buck, whether it's contributing to the environment. It is producing some really important outcomes. John has hinted at how our cities are not just the problem, but potentially can be the solution as well.
Absolutely.
Yep.
This is what people talking about, always talk about these things as terms of the cost and how we're going to afford to do that. Quietly, there are huge values being created by the government in various ways, which are never captured. I mean, wind for a start. One of the things that irks me, coal and gas, whatever, pay a royalty for pulling it out of the ground. People who put up the wind turbine don't pay anything. It's a free good that they take away and then export, and we're not getting any return on that. When I was talking about the changing the planning scheme, when you change a planning scheme, you upzone various areas. You're creating enormous wealth for various people where those things are created. And we don't take any of that back. They do in some places. In the ACT, they take 100% betterment levy, and they've just introduced in Victoria a 50% betterment levy, which is better because it still leaves in place the incentive to bring about the changes that they want to make. I've been arguing till I'm blue in the face with every member of the PLP here saying we should introduce that because of going through a round of big rezoning changes. If we adopted that as a policy where we were taking that 50% benefit, we could fund public housing, roads, public transport, and basically redistribute the wealth that's been created more equitably amongst everybody, which it should be a basic Labor principle. So I'm going to keep driving this until I'm blue in the face.
So it's a really good point.
Just a little bit more.
Well, basically, if you have a block of land that you can have a house on, if it's upgraded so you can build flats on it, the value goes up $1 million. When you put in a DA to assess that, then the government says, okay, we'll have half of that. Thanks very much. $500,000 goes into a fund that you can use for other things.
Yeah, it's called value capture in some places, but it's basically this idea of betterment or uplift that you get when you rezone land. So you could have a rural block of land and it's worth so much money per hectare. You rezone that to urban, it's worth an enormous amount more just by changing a colour on a map.
Most of the wealthy families in Australia have made their wealth out of that. The land boomers in Victoria were the basis of the wealth that was in Victoria, basically.
So if you take a fraction of that and redistribute it, which is what Labor's all about, and you will have seen that in my presentation, signalling very clearly this environmental blackmail we have and how we need to be looking after people who don't have the means otherwise to survive the crisis that's coming our way, then we can start to make a difference. So the solar comment I made tweaked an idea. I'll come back to that just in a second if I can, because the last one I wanted to just mention was poo. My students always laugh when I say that as well. Cities generate an enormous amount of effluent, and it's a wasted resource. It really is. There's a few hints in the State of Environment report about liquid waste. There's a few hints about the circular economy. But if we start to close some of these material loops in our cities, we can take effluent and turn it into fertiliser, sure, but we can also be generating biogas and having green energy from what is otherwise just released into our waterways as such a waste.
The Hobart pool is warmed from the sewerage plant.
Right.
Yeah.
So my question, well, actually, it's more a point. On the less or more scenario, right? Do we need all these wind turbines versus, say, using some rooftop solar? When I do energy auditing and you look at the payback in residential houses, in Tasmania we still have a lot of houses that have no wall insulation, minimal ceiling insulation, and typically they're in the houses where the poor people are living anyway. And so I'm a huge believer that the Labor Party here should be adopting a scheme very similar to the Victorians have, the BEU scheme or the BEAT scheme it used to be known as, where when you pay a power bill, a little bit of that goes into a pot of money that you can access at any time to get your house insulated or buy a heat pump instead of resistive element heater. Because if you look at that versus putting solar on in Tasmania, where we might have a capacity factor of maybe only 14% versus the high 20s for the mainland, you're far better off insulating your house first, which is also typically made from recycled material, recycled glass or recycled polyester versus new virgin materials to make those solar components.
So I love this line of thinking, and I think it would be really productive for Labor. One example I have been pondering was the second interconnector. So when we sell electricity to the mainland during peak times, this, the sale of that is in the order of millions of dollars an hour in profit that's being generated. It's a huge sum of money that we're making out of selling that to the mainland grid. If we took a fraction of that and created a fund and used that to insulate, to take care of the most desperate low-income housing areas that won't have the ability to do that otherwise, we effectively create some surplus electricity by lowering energy demand in those houses as well. So it's a kind of win-win. So this is the sort of thinking that I reckon we need to adopt to provide real, meaningful alternative choices to the current nonsense that we're presented with by the existing government.
We put that, Marty and I put that to Dean Winter before the last election. He was saying, what do we think about Marinus? I said, well, the good news is that it's essential for the mainland to and that the hydro will make a lot of profit out of selling into the peak market. The bad news is that will force up prices in Tasmania, so people, but then the good news of that is you own all the infrastructure, therefore you can give it back. So we said, simply determine how much extra profit the hydro's made, give it back as a rebate to the populace as a flat rebate. Mark McGowan did it in Western Australia, $500 a household, and the lower households benefited enormously. My daughter in Perth didn't pay a power bill for a year because of that rebate, and the upper market, it didn't...
I'm actually totally against that though, because it stops people from investing in energy efficiency. So you've got to make it available for efficiency or for heat pump upgrades, because otherwise poor people who are not energy educated go, oh great, I've now got it, I've paid off my bill this month, awesome. But they're not spending that money on the things they actually need to because they're not aware.
So I think the targeted upgrade is really important. One of the big mistakes we made under Rudd was rushing the insulation scheme and not accrediting people, and that blew up, and it was such a loss of great political capital and such a fantastic idea that just got kind of blown up at the last minute. But if we shouldn't look at that moment of defeat and stop. It was a great idea.
No, it was brilliant.
We should run again with those kinds of initiatives.
That was more Rudd than anybody else, I think you might find. Too late for that. Go.
Getting back to poo, I grew up in Brisbane, Queensland. In the late 50s, 60s, there was almost no sewerage. It was outside Dunnies. Outside, you had to go and sit with the redbacks outside of the house. But along came Clem Jones, a Labor Lord Mayor, and Whitlam, and said, enough's enough, let's get this done. And they did it. The political will was there. And Brisbane suddenly became on the path to what it is now, Bris Vegas, quite an attractive city, especially around the river, cleaned up, very attractive, high wealth. But so what is Tasmania's outside Dunny moment to get that sort of momentum?
It's a great question, because I've been thinking about that based on the economics talk we had this morning, and that we only have so much money in the state, so many human resources. Where do we find those areas that we could leverage to make a big difference? Energy is the one that I've been thinking of a little bit, but does anyone on the panel have other ideas?
I'd spend it on public transport. We really so badly need that, but it's. I think they've been campaigning within Labor for a trackless tram running up the Brooker Highway and into the city, because of the value, the twofold thing, the value impact it would have on the land and the opportunities it would open up for medium density housing along that corridor. The existing rail corridor is virtually built out and is too narrow anyway for the purposes of trams. You have to rebuild all the bridges and whatever, so you might as well run a trackless tram on the Brooker, because that's where the big sites are, where you could really do some housing and really connect up some places directly into the city. But it needs that, And I used to run the Urban Projects Unit in New South Wales, and I had Nick Greiner to convince about things the government should be doing. Well, the base argument I always put to him is saying, well, look, government should intervene where the preponderance of benefits are in externalities, not in direct benefits. The direct benefits, your private market can do it. You can build your freeways with a toll, but certain things, like the Sydney Harbour Bridge, need to be built by government because nobody else is going to do it. But you will be creating, what you should do is the value you're creating, appropriate enough of it back to pay for the infrastructure and then move on. That's all you have to do. There's something like a tram, nobody else is going to build that, the private sector won't, because the benefits are too far out. But without getting too technical, the government has a lower cost of capital, so things in the future are worth more to it than the private sector. So those things should be done by government. That's where I would be looking to have that sort of breakthrough moment. That's the sort of thing that could transform Hobart, I think, with a relatively minor expense.
So there's spin-off productivity benefits there as well, right? If you're not sitting behind the wheel of your car, you can be doing other things, like, for example, being on the trackless tram and doing email and or coming up with a play script or writing the next novel or whatever the case is, or thinking about alternatives to wind farm technologies, whatever it might be. The other one is contact with other people. When we're in our cars, in our little cocoons, we are socially isolated, and we have among the highest levels of car dependence in Australia, here in Tasmania. Hobart and Launceston are the fourth worst and worst cities in Australia when it comes to access to public transport. And we have very high levels of people not being able to get access to jobs or healthcare or other opportunities because they don't have a vehicle. By addressing that, you get all of these kind of multiplier benefits as well. Eric?
I want to return back to the question. I don't think of infrastructure. I think of the natural capital that we have in Tasmania. We're so fortunate to live in Tasmania, and yet most Tasmanians don't appreciate how lucky they are to live in Tasmania. And it takes people from outside the state to come in and tell us how lucky we are, and then we don't believe them anyway, and we just dismiss them. What would they know? For me, and Vanessa made the point that 50% of Tasmania is protected in the National Reserve estate. In the reserve estate here in Tasmania, but it's one habitat type. If you look at the reserve estate in Tasmania, it fails the comprehensive, adequate and representative criteria. There's an awful lot of button grass that's protected, but things like blue gum, which is our native plant or our endemic plant emblem for Tasmania, it's endangered. We're losing. There is an imbalance between what has been done and what needs to be done. This is what Vanessa was saying, that in the same with marine protected areas, it's all too hard, and yet we could garner so much international tourism. Many years ago, I suggested that Tasmania should be the safety valve for mainlanders. They come here and de-stress and detox from modern life as we claim to know it. How much?
And then we send them back.
Oh yeah, no, don't even get me going about human population. That's a whole nother issue. But fundamentally, rather than going, before COVID, we had 1.7 million visitors a year to Tasmania per year. State government at the moment has a policy of, I think, 2.7 million visitors a year. We don't have the roads, we don't have the housing, we don't have the infrastructure for that. I don't want to see 2.7 million people in Tasmania, because it means that 6 out of every 7 people when you walk around the street are from interstate or overseas. There are reasons why European cities have started putting caps on tourists visiting Barcelona or Venice or whatever else, because the locals have lost connection with their own homes, their own place. We don't want that to happen. So we should go for quality, not quantity. This is me speaking. So we have the World Heritage properties. The government's trying to trash the World Heritage. The fact that they developed a tourism management plan for the World Heritage property before they developed the management plan for the World Heritage shows you their priorities. We need to be so precious, and again, this is what Vanessa said, we need to be so precious with what we've got left, because once we lose it, it's gone. It can't be recreated. This whole kerfuffle about de-extincting the Tasmanian tiger, I think is appalling. Because if you get into the mindset, well, it doesn't matter if species goes extinct, we can bring it back, you devalue nature to the point where it becomes a commodity. And that's fundamentally wrong on so many levels to me.
Maybe we could bring back Bob Hall.
The perfect example of your quality versus quantity that I came across is the ocean liners that come into Hobart.
Yep.
The boutique ones that take 50 people produce 10 times the onshore reward than the
floating cities
do.
Yeah.
Do you know why we don't have those? And I had the chance to tackle the harbour master about this, because Tasports gets paid by the tonne. On the ship, so they get paid $100,000 a day for a ship that's in there. They get paid a couple of thousand for a boutique ship.
Yeah.
So they move those from pillar to post. Yep. We had the world's most expensive charter boat in Hobart a couple of years ago, the Woehler. It's the biggest yacht that's there, and they have 17 people on board. They were just cruising around the world having a look. Intended to stay in Hobart for a day. They actually stayed for 3 weeks, and in that 3 weeks they were moved 6 times around the port because it wasn't convenient for them for the big ships to be here. Those people spent millions while they were there, whereas the big cruise liners didn't. We need to have a clearer strategy over the top. That's,
Could I just ask, no, we're getting towards the end.
We'll call this the last question.
No.
Alexis's talk this morning reminded me we've got 570,000 people and we're basically going broke. And we can't, one reason we haven't done a state of environment report, I would guess, is we don't have enough people or resources within government to even, on a regular basis, fund it, even if it is independent people, which is good. I don't believe it's the upper echelons of the public service. I mean, Alexis is an example. He's obviously a highly talented person, but I don't see the government here as being competent. And I'm not saying this in a political way. We've got a small parliament. We've got a small public service. We've got a small economy. So, which would actually sort of match what local governments would have everywhere else.
It does.
They're not expected to run, quarantine, da. So is the level of governance one of the big problems that we don't have in meeting the aims that you've all said that I totally agree with? But I've sort of lost faith in the, I mean, you make jokes about the ferries, but I just don't know where the money and the resources in a state this size is going to come from to protect what is nationally important environment.
And the talent as well. I mean, I had a bit of an epiphany. I was arguing about I assumed that there was a strategy for replacing the Tasman Bridge, which had been knocked over once and probably will be again in its life. And I had a chance to talk to the head of state growth about it and the road part. And I said, "What's the strategy? You're researching, where are you going to put a tunnel? What are you going to do?" They said, "No, we haven't done I suppose we should, but haven't done a thing about it." And then I realised that the population of Tasmania, not just Hobart, is the equivalent of the population of Randwick in Sydney, one suburb. And the council there runs the infrastructure and the policy for everything for that. And I started to see the people in government here a bit more sympathetically, that they just don't have the people. They don't have the resources and never will have. I think we have to accept that we have to look at it that way. We are a regional area which only has that level of resource, and we need assistance, I think, federal assistance to tackle all of these problems.
So I would partly agree with that, but I think we throw away things
I
here.
hope I'm wrong. Please rebut me.
I think we throw away things here that we shouldn't. So a good example is, like, where are all the young people in the room here? There's a couple, right? A lot of them are heading off to the mainland for different opportunities. So part of our environment platform needs to think about how can we create livelihood opportunities, green jobs, environmentally friendly opportunities that will keep younger people here, that resource that was mentioned this morning, who can be highly skilled and trained up and help us make this transition that we need to make. So a good example is the cruise ships. Why are we not hooking them up to the on-land power rather than letting them run their belching engines and you see the smoke, where places like Los Angeles are like, no way, you're hooking up to our online power and we're going to charge you for it while you're in port. I mean, we just let them get away with stuff, right? We do the same with the development industry. So I think part of the solution is, yes, about the way we govern, but it's also about how, like how we throw away things here and let people get away with it, where in other states they wouldn't.
Yes,
Because you've got to
Andrew.
remember who funds the Liberal Party's re-election campaign.
Mm.
I mean, all